Welcome back to the channel, where the hidden corners of history are brought vividly to life, not as dates on a page, but as footsteps you can almost hear echoing through time. The night is heavy with silence. The lamps along Whitehall glow with a faint yellow halo in the mist, and the streets of London are hushed, as if the city itself is holding its breath. You feel the dampness in the air cling to your skin, the faint drizzle dotting your coat as you walk. Each step you take is muffled against the pavement, swallowed by the fog that curls around the lampposts. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls the hour, a sound both ordinary and ominous. The streets are almost empty, but you can sense the presence of unseen eyes, policemen on patrol, clerks hurrying home, soldiers already preparing for orders they cannot yet name. And there, in the dim glow, a solitary figure walks slowly, his pace deliberate, his shoulders bent beneath more than age. Winston Churchill, the man who has fought his way back into power, walks alone in the early hours of September 3rd, 1939. In just a few hours, he will rise in Parliament to announce that Britain is at war with Germany. But here, in the fragile stillness of dawn, he is not yet the voice of defiance, not yet the bulldog of legend. He is a man, pacing through London's heart, carrying the weight of civilization in his chest. Churchill's hand brushes against the brim of his Homburg hat as he pulls it lower against the drizzle. His cigar is unlit, resting forgotten between his fingers. An almost unheard-of detail for a man rarely seen without smoke curling from his lips. The streets carry the smell of wet stone, petrol, and the faint metallic tang of the Thames drifting through the mist. He turns into St. James's Park, boots crunching softly on the gravel path. The gas lamps here are fewer, the shadows deeper, the silence absolute. In the stillness, he listens, not just to the quiet city, but to the echoes of history itself. He hears the footsteps of Pitt the Younger, who guided Britain through the Napoleonic Wars. He feels the ghost of Disraeli whispering about empire, and the steady, solemn shadow of his own father, Lord Randolph Churchill, who once dreamed of power but died too young to claim it. For Winston, this walk is more than a habit. It is ritual, a moment to prepare himself, not only as a politician, but as a man about to stand before the world and demand sacrifice. He knows what war means. He has seen it firsthand. The trenches of Flanders, the charge at Omdurman, the disastrous Gallipoli campaign he himself had helped shape. He has seen the mud, the screams, the mothers in mourning. And he knows that in the morning light, when his voice carries across the chamber and over the radios of Britain, he will be leading his people back into the abyss. And yet, as he walks, there is no hesitation in his stride. He has waited for this moment, not the war, but the chance to stand where he believes he belongs. In 1932, he had warned of Germany's rearmament. In 1938, he had thundered against appeasement. They had called him a warmonger, a relic of the past. But now, in the mist of St. James's Park, as Big Ben's chimes echo faintly across the Thames, history is bending toward him. Churchill pauses at the edge of the park, his gaze lifting to the faint outline of the Palace of Westminster. Its Gothic spires rise like sentinels through the haze, dark against the paling sky. In a few hours, that hall will be filled with the murmur of voices, the shifting of papers, the turning of heads, all awaiting his words. He thinks of the speeches he has delivered in the past, of the phrases that rolled off his tongue with bravado. But tonight, the words he prepares are heavy, grave, stripped of flourish. Behind him, a policeman clears his throat softly, a respectful reminder of the hour. Churchill nods, then resumes walking. His steps are slower now, the drizzle seeping through his coat. He does not rush. There is no point. He is not hurrying to escape the silence, but prolonging it, savoring these last moments of solitude before he becomes the symbol, the rallying cry, the iron will of a nation. As dawn begins to break, he reaches Downing Street. The black door of number 10 looms before him, its brass gleaming faintly in the dim light. A momentary pause, his hand on the knob, his reflection staring back at him in the polished surface. Behind that door, aides wait, papers stacked, telephones ready to buzz with messages from Paris, Warsaw, Berlin. Beyond that threshold, there is no turning back. He exhales, the faint scent of cigar smoke still clinging to his coat, though he has not lit one in hours. His walk is over. The man is about to become the myth. And with that, Winston Churchill pushes open the door. Inside number 10, the atmosphere is thick with tension, though the house itself remains quiet. The old Georgian walls hold the silence, broken only by the faint shuffle of secretaries, the whisper of typewriters in adjoining rooms, and the creak of leather chairs being shifted as men wait. Churchill removes his hat and coat slowly, laying them across a chair in the hallway. His face is still wet from the drizzle outside, droplets clinging to his cheeks like beads of sweat. His valet hovers discreetly, offering a towel, but Churchill waves him off with a grunt. He does not want to be fussed over this morning. He wants space. He wants his thoughts to remain sharp and unbroken. He makes his way toward the study. The air inside smells faintly of tobacco and ink, layered over decades of power. On his desk, the morning papers are spread out. The Times, the Daily Telegraph, the Morning Post. Headlines scream of Hitler's invasion of Poland, of cities burning under the Luftwaffe, of German columns advancing with ruthless efficiency. Even in the quiet of Downing Street, the thunder of tanks and the cries of refugees seem to bleed through the ink. Churchill lowers himself into his chair. It creaks beneath his weight. He leans forward, elbows planted on the desk, cigar finally lit now, smoke curling into the stillness. He studies the reports with eyes that are sharp but shadowed. For years he had warned of this day. Now it has arrived, and the vindication carries no triumph, only dread. The clock on the mantelpiece ticks loudly, each second falling like a hammer. He knows that later today, Neville Chamberlain, still Prime Minister, will speak to the nation first. But Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty once again, will follow with words that will matter not only to Britain's navy, but to the spirit of its people. The Admiralty telegram already lies prepared. Its code name is simple, almost cold. Winston is back. A signal sent to the fleet at sea, announcing his return to the office he last held during the Great War. Across the waters, captains and sailors will read those words and know that a man who believes in fighting has taken command again. For them, it will mean certainty. For Churchill, it means responsibility. The lives of tens of thousands at sea now hang on his orders. As the morning lengthens, ministers begin to arrive. Their faces are pale, drawn, lips tight as they step into the study. Some avoid Churchill's gaze, as if afraid to meet the steel in his eyes. Others nod curtly, acknowledging the man whose warnings they had dismissed for so long. He welcomes them not with warmth, but with a kind of grim camaraderie. They are bound together now, whether they like it or not. At 10 o'clock, a message arrives from Berlin. Hitler has ignored the ultimatum. German troops remain in Poland. Chamberlain has no choice but to declare war. The news is expected, yet when the words are spoken aloud, a silence fills the room, thick and suffocating. Churchill stares into the smoke rising from his cigar. His mind drifts, not to Poland, not to Hitler, but back to the faces of men he knew from the First World War. He remembers the mud of Ypres, the stench of corpses in the trenches, the endless roll of casualty lists. He remembers mothers in black and fathers with empty gazes. He had promised himself, back then, that such slaughter must never be repeated. And yet, here he is again, about to lead Britain into the fire. But this time, he tells himself, it is different. This war is not a failure of diplomacy or a matter of imperial rivalry. This war, in his heart, feels like a struggle for the soul of humanity. If Hitler is not stopped, he mutters quietly, almost to himself, then darkness will cover the earth. By 11, Churchill leaves Downing Street for the Admiralty. The streets outside are stirring now, filled with office workers and shopkeepers, their faces uneasy as rumors sweep through the city. Some look up at him as he passes in his car, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. He does not wave, does not smile. He simply nods once, acknowledging their silent questions. At the Admiralty, he steps into the grand old building with its echoing marble halls. Officers snap to attention, their boots striking hard against the stone. They sense it already. The old lion has returned. Churchill acknowledges them with the briefest of gestures and retreats to his private office. There, behind closed doors, he dictates messages with brisk urgency, his voice gravelly but steady. Orders to the fleet, warnings to commanders, cautionary notes to allies. His pen scratches across paper like a blade. The sea, as he knows too well, will be Britain's shield and lifeline. And now, with German U-boats already prowling, the fate of the nation depends on his decisions. He pauses for a moment, fingers pressed against the edge of his desk. For a fleeting instant, he allows himself to feel the enormity of it. Not just politics, not just speeches, but the lives of young sailors, men barely out of school, who will face death in the cold Atlantic. The hours crawl forward. At noon, Big Ben strikes. Each chime echoes across London, rolling like thunder. Chamberlain prepares to speak. Churchill, meanwhile, steps to the window, cigar in hand, gazing out at the city below. The people move like ants, unaware of the full weight of what is about to descend upon them. He closes his eyes. In his chest, he feels both the crushing weight of sorrow and the fierce ignition of resolve. The walk in the mist is behind him. Now begins the storm. The clock struck 11:15. Inside the wood-paneled chamber of the House of Commons, tension vibrated through the air like an invisible current. The benches were crowded, the air thick with the murmurs of statesmen and clerks, their faces pale with anticipation. At the front, Neville Chamberlain prepared to speak, a man weary, shoulders bent under the weight of decisions too long postponed. Churchill, seated only a few rows back, leaned slightly forward, his cigar burning slowly between his fingers. He knew what was coming. Every man in the room knew. And yet, when Chamberlain's voice finally broke the silence, it was as though history itself leaned in to listen. "I have to tell you now," Chamberlain said, his voice trembling but clear, "that no such undertaking has been received, and consequently, this country is at war with Germany." The words fell like a hammer blow. For a moment, there was no applause, no jeering, no interruption, only silence. A silence that was not empty but full of dread, of grief, of inevitability. Men glanced at one another, some with lips pressed tight, some with eyes lowered to the floor. Churchill let the silence settle into his chest. War. The word was no longer abstract. It was real. It was here. He closed his eyes briefly, inhaling the smoke from his cigar, letting it burn into him like a seal. Beyond the chamber, the city was already reacting. Crowds gathered around radios in homes, cafes, and pubs. The voice of Chamberlain crackled across the airwaves, reaching shopkeepers, factory workers, school children, and soldiers in barracks. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men who had fought in the Great War stared into the distance, their faces hardening with memory. The streets grew louder, the murmurs swelling into cries, conversations, arguments. London had awoken to a new reality. For Churchill, there was no time to dwell. As Chamberlain's words echoed beyond Westminster, Churchill rose from his seat, his face unreadable, and made his way out. His aides followed quickly, notebooks ready, eyes flicking nervously at the clock. Back at the Admiralty, a coded signal had already gone out to the fleet. Commence hostilities against Germany. A simple phrase, delivered across wires and waves, but behind it lay an ocean of consequence. In harbors from Scapa Flow to Gibraltar, in destroyers rocking on gray seas, in submarines lurking beneath the waves, British sailors received the message. Engines roared to life, hatches slammed shut, binoculars lifted to scan the horizon. For them, the war had begun not with speeches, but with orders. Churchill stepped into his Admiralty office just as a fresh telegram was placed before him. Reports of German U-boat activity in the North Sea. Merchant convoys at risk. He tapped his cigar against the ashtray, sparks scattering like tiny embers of the storm to come. He dictated swiftly, his gravelly voice commanding, each word crisp and final. Increase escort vessels. Protect shipping lanes. Maintain readiness for contact. His secretaries scribbled furiously, their pens racing to keep pace. But even as he worked, Churchill's mind remained haunted by the human cost. He thought of the boys in uniform, barely old enough to shave, standing on the decks of corvettes as the sea sprayed their faces. He remembered his own youth, his own taste of battle, and how it had marked him forever. He whispered, almost unconsciously, "God protect them," before continuing his work. As the afternoon darkened, the air inside the Admiralty grew stifling with smoke and urgency. Telephones rang constantly, messengers hurried in and out, typewriters clattered without pause. The building itself seemed alive, pulsing with energy, with fear, with determination. Yet, amid the chaos, Churchill remained steady, pacing, dictating, occasionally pausing to sip from a glass of brandy, his mind working like a machine. And then, as the first reports of naval skirmishes trickled in, a single event pierced through the storm of paperwork and orders. The passenger liner Athenia had been torpedoed by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland. Hundreds of civilians, men, women, and children, were in danger. The war's first civilian tragedy had arrived within hours of Chamberlain's announcement. When the news reached Churchill, he froze for a moment, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. His jaw clenched. He had expected such things, yes, but expectation was different from reality. Reality had faces, names, lives. He turned sharply to his staff, voice fierce. "Rescue operations at once. Everything possible must be done. Everything." The aides rushed to comply, but Churchill remained rooted, staring at the telegram. In his mind, he could see the faces of the passengers, frightened families, desperate cries in the night, lifeboats lowered into cold waters. He had only just resumed his role at the Admiralty, and already the sea was taking lives. He reached for his cigar again, hands trembling ever so slightly now. He lit it, drew deeply, and let the smoke fill his lungs. His eyes hardened, not with despair, but with resolve. "So it begins," he muttered to himself, almost like a prayer, almost like a curse. Outside, the skies above London had begun to shift. Clouds moved swiftly, the wind carrying with it the distant echo of sirens being tested. On the streets, people walked faster, glancing at the sky as though expecting planes to appear at any moment. London was no longer just a city, it was a target, and Winston Churchill, standing by the great windows of the Admiralty, knew it. He watched the gathering storm and felt it deep in his bones. The private walk in the mist had ended. The war had begun in earnest. As dusk fell over London, the city seemed transformed. The glow of the setting sun did not soften the mood. It sharpened it, casting long shadows across the cobblestones and gilding the clouds in blood orange. Every passerby carried an unspoken weight, their faces half illuminated, half darkened, as though the war had already begun to divide light from shadow. Churchill left the Admiralty in the late evening. His steps were brisk, his hat pulled low, the ever-present cigar glowing faintly in the dim light. Around him, the city stirred nervously. Air raid wardens in armbands patrolled the streets, their whistles dangling at the ready. Blackout curtains were being drawn across windows. Shopkeepers extinguished their lamps early. Already, London was adjusting, preparing itself for the specter of bombers that might appear at any hour. Churchill noticed the small things. The way a young boy clutched his mother's skirt, staring at the sky. The way an elderly man, medals pinned to his coat from the Great War, paused outside a pub before turning away, as though the noise of laughter had become inappropriate. Even the horses pulling carts along Whitehall seemed restless, their ears twitching at the faint wail of a siren being tested in the distance. When Churchill entered Downing Street, the lamps inside glowed warmly, but the warmth was deceptive. The house was filled with tension, clerks whispering in corners, aides rushing with papers, telephones buzzing relentlessly. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the narrow hall until he reached his study once more. There, the world's burdens waited on his desk. Telegrams, dispatches, casualty lists already beginning to form. But tonight, he allowed himself a ritual. From a sideboard, he poured a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. He lowered himself into his leather chair, exhaling deeply, the cigar smoke curling around him like a ghost. For a brief moment, he sat in silence, staring at the map of Europe pinned across the wall. Solitude. Pins and strings traced the outlines of German advances, the borders of nations teetering on collapse. Poland was already bleeding. France stood uncertain, and Britain, his Britain, had just stepped into the storm. He remembered, with sharp clarity, the first nights of the Great War, 25 years earlier. Then, too, there had been excitement mingled with dread. Young men marching with songs on their lips, crowds cheering, banners waving. That war had begun in optimism. This one began in silence. No cheering crowds, no parades, only fear, only resignation, only grim determination. As the evening deepened, ministers joined him in the study. They spoke in low tones, their words clipped, urgent. Reports from the Royal Navy. Patrols intensified, convoys diverted, submarines already suspected in the western approaches. Updates from the War Office. Mobilization orders, recruitment centers overwhelmed, reservists reporting in droves. Messages from Paris, the French government both resolute and anxious. Churchill listened intently, occasionally barking instructions, but more often nodding silently, absorbing the flood of information. His mind worked quickly, cataloging details, forming plans. Yet beneath the steel of his thoughts, there remained the human weight, the knowledge that every order carried consequences measured in lives. At 10 o'clock, the first real air raid alarm sounded over London. The sirens wailed, a long, rising shriek that tore through the night, echoing against the stone walls, rattling windows, seizing the hearts of those who heard it. Outside, people froze, then rushed for shelters. In underground stations, families huddled together, their whispers drowned out by the mournful sound above. Churchill stepped to his window, cigar in hand, and listened. The wail stretched on, chilling, unnatural. For a moment, it seemed to him as though the city itself were crying out. His aides shifted nervously behind him, but Churchill remained still, gazing into the night sky. No planes came, no bombs fell. It was a false alarm, a test, a warning. But the effect was real. Londoners would not sleep easily tonight. When the sirens finally faded, Churchill returned to his desk. He dictated a message to the fleet, his voice steady but edged with fire. Britain has entered upon a conflict for survival. Stand firm, strike hard, let there be no hesitation. His secretary wrote quickly, her pen scratching across the page, her hand trembling slightly. Near midnight, the house quieted. The staff dispersed. The papers were stacked. The telephones fell silent for the first time all day. Alone now, Churchill leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed once more on the map of Europe. He thought of his wife, Clementine, and their children. What fear must be pressing upon them tonight? He thought of the young men who would soon leave home, the mothers who would see them off, the fathers who would try to be brave. The whiskey glass was nearly empty when he rose. Slowly, he crossed the room, pulled the blackout curtain tight across the window, and stood for a long moment in the darkness. His reflection stared back faintly in the glass. Weary eyes, furrowed brow, the lines of age carved deep by decades of struggle. Yet in that reflection, there was also defiance. He whispered to himself, not loudly, but with conviction, "We shall prevail. Whatever the cost, we shall prevail." And with that, Winston Churchill extinguished his cigar, set down his glass, and prepared for his first night of war. The morning of September 4th, 1939, broke gray and damp. A light drizzle hung over the rooftops of London, dripping steadily from gutters, dampening the cobblestones, softening the echoes of carriage wheels and hurried footsteps. The city had awoken to its first full day of war, though no bombs had yet fallen. The unease was palpable. Inside Downing Street, the household stirred early. Clerks shuffled through corridors with papers pressed to their chests, telephones buzzed relentlessly, and the faint aroma of tea mingled with the sharper scent of cigarette smoke. In the study, Churchill sat at his desk, the early light filtering through the heavy curtains. His cigar glowed in the dimness, the smoke curling upward like a private ritual. In front of him lay stacks of reports. German submarines spotted, merchant ships rerouted, diplomatic cables exchanged in frantic tones. His eyes moved quickly, yet he lingered over one telegram. Confirmation of the sinking of the Athenia. Civilians drowned, children among the dead. The war had barely begun, and already the sea was stained with loss. Churchill pressed his hand against the desk, his fingers splayed wide, as though anchoring himself. He muttered softly, "They will not forgive this, nor should they." His secretary, seated quietly nearby, looked up but said nothing. She knew better than to interrupt when his thoughts moved like this, half aloud, half inward. By mid-morning, meetings began. Ministers entered with grave faces, their briefcases bulging with documents, their voices hushed. The cabinet table was crowded, maps spread out, pins marking fleets and divisions. Churchill sat among them, his presence commanding though he was not yet Prime Minister. He spoke sparingly, but when he did, the room shifted. His gravelly voice cut through hesitation. "We cannot afford timidity. The Navy must act boldly, for it is upon the sea that Britain's life depends." The others nodded, some reluctantly, some with grim agreement. They had heard him speak this way for years. Warning, urging, demanding preparation. Now, they could no longer ignore the truth of his words. Outside the halls of power, Britain's people were speaking too. Across the nation, radios crackled with broadcasts. Newsreaders with solemn tones announced the declaration of war, recounted the German invasion of Poland, urged calm, and explained blackout precautions. Families gathered in kitchens, their faces lit by the dull glow of the wireless, hanging on every word. In a small cottage in Kent, a mother hushed her children as the radio voice wavered. "This is a war we did everything to avoid. Now we must face it with courage and resolve." In a pub in Manchester, men stood shoulder to shoulder, pints untouched, listening in silence. In a schoolhouse in Edinburgh, children bowed their heads as their teacher explained that fathers and brothers might soon leave for the front. Churchill thought of these voices as he walked through the cabinet corridors later that day. The nation was not faceless to him. It was millions of individuals, workers in shipyards, miners in Wales, fishermen in the north, shopkeepers, factory girls, clerks, farmers. Each life was a thread in the fabric he was now sworn to defend. By afternoon, he returned to the Admiralty, where the machinery of war moved ceaselessly. Reports flowed in, submarine sightings, convoy routes, intelligence intercepts. The building vibrated with energy, with the pounding of typewriters, the clatter of boots, the ringing of telephones. Yet amid the chaos, there was order, the rhythm of a great machine beginning to turn. In his office, Churchill paused at the window once more, gazing out at the Thames. Barges drifted slowly along the water, their silhouettes blurred by mist. He thought of the sea as both shield and grave. The Navy was Britain's lifeline, but it was also where death would strike first. He whispered to himself, "The Navy is our first and last defense." That evening, as the sun sank once again, the BBC prepared to broadcast. Churchill was not yet to speak directly to the nation. That would come later. But he knew that his voice would soon be needed. Already, journalists whispered that he was the only man who seemed prepared for this hour. His words, his resolve, his very presence reassured many who feared the future. Before retiring, Churchill walked once more through the quiet halls of Downing Street. The lamplight flickered against the wallpaper, the silence broken only by the ticking of the old clock in the hall. He paused at the door leading to the street, placing his hand briefly on the knob, as he had the night before. Outside, the blackout lay heavy over London. Inside, the house breathed with the weight of decisions yet to come. He turned back slowly, whispering as though to the empty air, "They must hear strength in every word, for if we falter, they will falter, and we cannot afford faltering now." By the second full day of war, a peculiar stillness had settled over Britain. No bombs had yet fallen, no armies had clashed upon her soil, yet the nation seemed to live beneath an invisible shadow. It was the waiting, the dreadful anticipation of what everyone knew was coming. Churchill felt it too. In his study at the Admiralty, the day began early. The lamps still glowed as dawn broke beyond the windows, painting the Thames in streaks of pale silver. A file of documents lay open before him, but his gaze wandered toward the river. The tide rolled steadily, indifferent to war or peace, as it always had. That indifference was almost comforting. Yet inside him, there stirred memories he could not silence. He thought back to the First World War, to the bitter years when he too had sat in this office as First Lord of the Admiralty. He remembered the day he had gambled everything on the Gallipoli campaign, and how it had ended in disaster. The letters from mothers, the accusations in Parliament, the disgrace that had nearly ended his career. For years afterward, the word Dardanelles had haunted him like a curse. Now, he was back in the same office, seated at the same desk, with the same title, facing the same enemy nation. History had given him a second chance, but with it came the unbearable weight of memory. He muttered under his breath, as if to the ghost of his younger self, "This time, Winston, this time you must not fail." His staff noticed the intensity in him that morning. He spoke in clipped sentences, his dictation brisk, his demands relentless. Admirals were summoned, reports scrutinized, orders amended and reissued. Yet beneath his outward energy, his face was marked by fatigue. The lines around his eyes were deeper, his voice rasped more harshly than usual. He carried the burden of not just strategy, but of redemption. In the afternoon, he received a visitor, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, the First Sea Lord. A tall, imposing figure with heavy features, Pound entered with the stiffness of a man already consumed by strain. The two men spoke for nearly an hour, their conversation low but intense. Pound laid out the naval situation. Patrols stretched thin, U-boats prowling, merchant shipping at risk. Churchill listened, nodding slowly, occasionally puffing at his cigar. At last he rose and paced the room, his voice gaining strength. "We must not wait for them to starve us. We must choke them first. The Navy is our spear and our shield, and we must wield it without hesitation." His words carried the weight of command, but also the fire of conviction. Pound listened, nodded, and departed with his orders. When the door closed, Churchill sagged briefly into his chair, as though the performance of strength had drained him. He sipped at his whiskey, staring at the map of Europe again. Every pin, every red line, every shaded area represented lives, movements, hopes, and fears. He whispered to the empty room, "The whole fate of our island rides upon this board." That evening, as the city grew quiet under blackout, Churchill allowed himself a rare moment of solitude. He lit another cigar and sat back in his chair, closing his eyes. And in that darkness, memories flooded him once more. The trenches of Flanders, the mud, the cold, the sound of shells. The faces of young men came unbidden, men he had seen fall, men he had ordered forward. He opened his eyes abruptly, shaking his head as though to drive the ghosts away. Rising, he walked to the window and drew the curtain aside just enough to glimpse the faint moonlight over London. The city lay cloaked in darkness, its outlines softened, its landmarks hidden, and yet, even in darkness, it endured. He took a long breath, steadying himself. "Yes," he murmured, "they endured then, and they will endure now." Behind him, the clock struck 9. The house stirred again as aides brought fresh reports. The war had only just begun, but already the weight of memory pressed heavily upon him. Churchill turned back to his desk, his face hardening with resolve. The ghosts of the past might haunt him, but they would not paralyze him. This time, he vowed, Britain would not be led into ruin. This time, he would fight until the very end. The following morning, the house at Downing Street was quieter than usual. The flurry of aides and messengers had been redirected toward the Admiralty, leaving the residents hushed except for the sound of footsteps on the stairs and the soft clink of china in the breakfast room. Churchill sat at the head of the table, his plate barely touched. A half-finished egg cooled in its dish, toast left uneaten. His cigar smoke coiled upward in lazy spirals as he stared into the distance, thoughts circling endlessly. Across from him, Clementine Churchill studied her husband with quiet intensity. She had lived beside this man for decades, through triumph and disgrace, through ambition and exile. She knew when he needed encouragement, and she knew when silence was the greater gift. This morning, she offered silence. The light through the window was muted by the blackout curtains, filtering into the room in soft gray streaks. Outside, London was subdued. Fewer motor cars, more bicycles, shop windows dimmed, newspapers clutched tightly in anxious hands. The war was only days old, yet already life had changed. Finally, Clementine spoke, her voice steady, low. "Winston, you cannot carry it all alone." He turned to her, his eyes heavy, shadowed. For a moment, he almost snapped, the instinct of a man long used to argument, but he stopped himself. Instead, he let out a sigh, sinking deeper into his chair. "I do not intend to carry it all, Clemmy, but it seems it has been placed upon me nonetheless." She leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. "You have always lived for great moments. You sought them, even when others turned away. Now you have one. Do not let it crush you. Use it." Churchill did not reply immediately. He took a slow puff from his cigar, watching the smoke drift across the table. In her words, he heard not only encouragement, but also warning. A reminder that his strength could so easily become stubbornness, that his fire could burn too hot. She had always been his balance, his anchor. At length, he nodded. Yes, I must use it. After breakfast, he retreated to his study, but Clementine's presence lingered in his mind. He remembered their letters during the First World War, her steady words when he faced the Gallipoli disaster, her refusal to let him wallow in despair. She had been the quiet strength behind his bluster, the calm that steadied his storms. Without her, he often admitted privately, he might have been destroyed long ago. Later that day, as he walked through the Admiralty, the chaos pressed upon him again. Orders, telegrams, reports, all demanding attention. Yet in the back of his mind, Clementine's words echoed. Do not let it crush you. Use it. That evening, when he returned home, she was waiting in the drawing room, seated beneath the dim glow of the lamp. He lowered himself into a chair opposite her, his shoulders sagging with fatigue. For a few minutes, they said nothing. Then, almost absent-mindedly, Churchill began to speak of the day's events. The fleet movements, the submarine reports, the cabinet's hesitations. Clementine listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She offered few words, only the occasional nod, the quiet murmur of understanding. For him, it was enough. He did not need solutions from her. He needed the space to lay down his burdens, if only for an hour. When the clock struck 10, he rose and kissed her hand. You are my fortress, Clemmy, he whispered. She smiled faintly, replying, Then see to it that your fortress stands strong for them as well. That night, as Churchill extinguished his cigar and drew the blackout curtain across his window, he felt a little lighter than he had the night before. The war was still a storm raging beyond his control, but he knew that within these walls, he had a source of calm he could always return to. In the days and years to come, he would carry the roar of Parliament, the clash of armies, the weight of the free world. But tonight, he carried also the quiet strength of Clementine, and it steadied him. By the end of the first week, Britain no longer felt like the same country. Streets were darker, voices quieter, and everywhere there was an air of waiting, as though the whole island were holding its breath. The government, too, had shifted. Routines hardened, hierarchies tightened, and the state had begun to turn itself into a machine of war. For Churchill, the Admiralty became both fortress and command post. Each morning he entered its echoing marble halls, greeted by the click of boots and the scent of ink and smoke. The building pulsed with activity, messengers hurrying with files, officers bent over maps, telephones buzzing without pause. The war was still in its early, uncertain days, yet here the machinery was already grinding forward. Churchill moved through it with restless energy. He demanded constant reports, peppered his staff with questions, and paced the length of his office as dispatches came in. His presence was both exhausting and invigorating to those around him. One secretary later admitted, he worked like a man possessed. He was fire and thunder all in one room. The heart of his day was the war room, where naval charts stretched across great tables. Tiny flags marked the positions of fleets, convoys, and suspected U-boats. Each pin was a life, a risk, a possibility. Churchill leaned over the maps with intensity, cigar clenched between his teeth, his finger tracing the routes across the North Sea, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean. Here, he would bark, stabbing at the chart. Increase escort here, double the destroyers, and here, press harder. The Germans must never feel safe in their own waters. His aides scrambled to take notes, their pencils scratching furiously against paper. Admirals nodded gravely, though more than once they left his presence sweating under the sheer force of his demands. Yet Churchill was not simply a commander. He was a communicator. Midday, he summoned his secretaries to draft memoranda, his words dictated with rapid-fire precision. Some were sharp reprimands, others rousing exhortations. One message to the fleet read, "We enter upon this conflict with clear purpose. Strike fast, strike hard, and let no sailor doubt that he serves in the greatest cause of our time." Outside the Admiralty, the war machine grew too. Posters went up on lampposts. "Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory." Recruitment centers filled with men lining up to enlist. Factories began converting production lines, riveters hammering late into the night. And everywhere, the sound of typewriters and stamping boots reminded the people that a nation was being reshaped in real time. Churchill noticed the change most vividly in the corridors of government. The easy politeness of pre-war meetings had vanished. Now, every exchange was urgent, every decision edged with consequence. Cabinet members argued fiercely, voices raised, tempers short. But above it all, Churchill's voice carried, booming, gravelly, impossible to ignore. Still, he was not blind to the strain. He saw the fatigue in the faces of junior officers, the pale hands of clerks scribbling through the night. Once, pausing outside a typing pool, he noticed a young woman asleep at her desk, her head resting on a pile of papers. He stood for a moment, the fire in him briefly softened. "They too are soldiers," he murmured, before moving on. That evening, as he returned home, the machinery of war echoed even in the streets. Lorries rumbled past carrying sandbags. Searchlights swept the darkening sky. Wardens checked blackout blinds, their torches flashing briefly in doorways. The city itself seemed conscripted. Back in his study, Churchill removed his hat and coat and lowered himself into the armchair with a sigh. He poured his whiskey, lit his cigar, and let the day's exhaustion settle into his bones. For all his energy, he was not immune to weariness. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the glass. He gazed at the map again. Europe, divided and trembling. The machinery of war was turning now, inexorable, grinding forward into a future no one could yet see. He thought of the coming months, the battles not yet fought, the sacrifices not yet made. And in the silence of the night, he whispered to himself, "This is only the beginning. The hardest days are still ahead." By the second week of September 1939, the war had already begun reshaping the continent. German forces pressed deeper into Poland, their tanks grinding through fields and villages, their planes raining destruction from the sky. Each telegram arriving at the Admiralty carried fresh evidence of brutality. Warsaw under bombardment, civilians fleeing in endless columns, the Polish army retreating yet still fighting with desperate courage. Churchill read these reports with a clenched jaw, smoke rising thick from his cigar. He had visited Poland once, years earlier, on diplomatic travel. He remembered its wide plains, its bustling cities, its proud people. Now he pictured those same streets reduced to rubble, those same fields scarred with fire. In meetings with the cabinet, he pressed his colleagues fiercely. Poland fights for her life, and for ours. Every day she holds is a day we gain. We must act not as spectators, but as allies. His words carried conviction, yet he knew the truth. Britain was not ready to strike decisively. Mobilization had only begun. Troops were being deployed to France, but they were not yet in battle. For now, all they could do was watch as Poland burned. The frustration gnawed at him. He had returned to power to fight, yet the fight seemed always just out of reach. Britain had declared war, but not yet truly engaged. He muttered bitterly to an aide one evening, "A war declared but not fought is a war already half lost." Still, he understood the necessity of patience. At the Admiralty, his focus remained on the seas. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic with deadly intent. Convoys carrying food and munitions from across the empire were their prey, and Churchill knew that without those supplies, Britain would wither. He ordered more escorts, demanded tighter formations, insisted on vigilance. "The lifeline must not break," he growled. One evening, a fresh telegram arrived. Another merchant ship sunk in the North Sea, survivors adrift in lifeboats. Churchill slammed his fist onto the desk, the glasses on its surface rattling. "Every sinking is murder," he thundered. "And for every life they take, we must answer with resolve tenfold." His secretary scribbled furiously, his words soon to become orders. Beyond the Admiralty, the mood in Britain was shifting too. In the streets of London, there was no cheering, no illusions of quick victory. Instead, there was a grim quietness. People queued for rations, fitted their gas masks, dug air raid shelters in their gardens. In schoolyards, children practiced evacuations, their small hands clutching suitcases and identity tags. The war had become personal, woven into daily life. Churchill saw it in the faces around him. The typists who worked past midnight, their eyes red with fatigue. The naval officers, their uniforms rumpled, their voices hoarse from endless briefings. Even the drivers who ferried him through London moved with a wary alertness, scanning the skies as though bombers might appear at any moment. At home, Clementine watched him with concern. She knew the signs of strain, the deep furrows in his brow, the restless pacing late into the night, the whiskey glass refilled too often. Yet she also knew that he was driven by something beyond himself. He was no longer merely Winston Churchill, politician and orator. He had become something larger, a vessel for the will of a nation. That night, after a long day of reports and arguments, he stood once more at the window of his study, the blackout curtain drawn back just enough to reveal the faint shimmer of the moon. The city below was silent, its lights extinguished, its people asleep or pretending to be. He thought of Poland again, of her soldiers fighting in the dark, of her cities aflame. He thought of Britain, untested still, yet bracing for what was to come. And he thought of himself, the man who had walked through mist and silence only days earlier, and who now stood at the threshold of a storm. "Let them come," he whispered into the night. "Let them come, and we shall meet them with fire." He closed the curtain, extinguished his cigar, and returned to his desk. The shadows over Europe were lengthening, but he was determined they would not consume the island he called home. The middle of September 1939 brought with it an eerie paradox. Britain was at war, yet for many it did not yet feel like war. The Luftwaffe had not yet appeared over London, the German armies were still far away, and the sounds of gunfire echoed only across the fields of Poland. It was a strange, suspended moment, a silence pregnant with dread. In later years, this uneasy period would be called the phony war. But for Churchill, there was nothing phony about it. At the Admiralty, he knew the struggle had already begun, beneath the waves. Reports streamed in daily, U-boats shadowing convoys, ships torpedoed in the cold Atlantic, survivors plucked from lifeboats half dead from exposure. For the public, these tragedies were distant headlines. For Churchill, they were personal. He pored over the names of lost vessels, the tonnage of cargo destroyed, the sailors drowned. Each report etched itself into his mind like a scar. He stalked the war room with restless energy, cigar clenched between his teeth, boots echoing against the stone floor. His staff could barely keep pace. "We must think like the hunter, not the hunted," he barked one morning. "If the U-boats prowl the seas, then we must strike first, hunt them down, make the Atlantic a grave for German steel." Admirals listened, some nodding, others wary. The war at sea was a brutal, invisible contest. It offered no glory, no parades, only attrition, only loss. And Churchill knew it would test Britain's endurance to the core. Beyond strategy, he turned his attention to morale. He insisted that every signal to the fleet carry not just orders, but inspiration. He dictated one such message himself. "The duty before you is hard, but it is noble. Remember, you guard not only the waters, but the very life of our nation." His secretaries recorded the words, their hands flying as they tried to match his urgency. At home, London carried on beneath the uneasy calm. Buses still rattled along the streets, markets still bustled, children still played in courtyards. Yet everywhere, the signs of war were visible. Sandbags piled against public buildings, air raid shelters dug in parks, barrage balloons drifting lazily in the sky. The ordinary blended with the extraordinary. Churchill noticed it most when he left the Admiralty at night. The blackout transformed London into a ghost city. No lamps, no neon signs, no glowing windows, only shadows. Walking through Whitehall, he sometimes felt as though he had stepped into another century, the silence broken only by the footsteps of wardens and the distant bark of dogs unsettled by the dark. One evening, as he rode back to Downing Street, the car slowed near Trafalgar Square. Through the gloom, he saw a small group gathered around a wireless set, the faint voice of a BBC announcer carrying into the night air. Faces leaned in close, anxious, straining to catch every word. Churchill stared for a moment, struck by their vulnerability, by the way news now carried the weight of survival. Back at home, Clementine sat by the fire, knitting silently. She looked up as he entered, offering the faintest of smiles. "You look worn, Winston," she said gently. He grunted in reply, lowering himself into the armchair opposite. For a while they sat in silence, the fire crackling softly between them. In that moment, he felt the depth of what they were all waiting for. The storm that had not yet broken, but that everyone knew would come. Later, as he prepared for bed, Churchill paused at the window. He drew the blackout curtain aside just enough to glimpse the sky. The stars glittered faintly above, indifferent to the struggles below. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel the quiet, the strange, deceptive quiet of a war not yet fully unleashed. He whispered into the darkness, as though speaking to the unseen future. "This silence cannot last, and when it breaks, it will break like thunder." With that, he closed the curtain, extinguished his cigar, and stepped into the long night, carrying the weight of anticipation with him. The last weeks of September stretched on with a peculiar rhythm. Each day brought new telegrams from Poland, each darker than the last. German forces swept forward relentlessly. Warsaw encircled, its streets scarred with bomb craters, its civilians starving, its soldiers fighting to the last. The Soviets, too, had crossed Poland's eastern border, sealing her fate. In the war cabinet, men spoke in grave tones, their voices heavy with unease. Britain and France had declared war, yes, but they had not yet struck. The armies sat behind the Maginot Line, guns idle, soldiers restless. The newspapers began to whisper the unspoken question: was Britain truly fighting? Churchill bristled at the suggestion. At the Admiralty, he knew the fight was real, if unseen. British destroyers scoured the seas, convoys zigzagged across the Atlantic, patrol aircraft swept the skies. Each night, signals reported more skirmishes, more torpedoes fired, more lives lost. The battle had already begun in the cold waters, and Churchill could feel it tightening around the island. Yet still, the silence from the air was uncanny. No Luftwaffe bombers yet over London, no sirens wailing through the night, no craters gouging the streets. The people carried gas masks in satchels, blacked out their windows, dug shelters in their gardens, but the bombs did not fall. It was as though Britain waited for a storm that would not break. In the evenings, Churchill sometimes left the Admiralty late and walked a short distance on foot, accompanied discreetly by a bodyguard. The blackout cloaked everything in shadow. He passed silent shop fronts, doorways hidden in darkness, street lamps hooded. The city felt both familiar and strange, its heartbeat muffled. Once, he stopped near St. James's Park and listened. The silence was absolute. He muttered, half to himself, "They are holding their thunder, but it will come." Inside, he carried the weight of that waiting. Each cabinet meeting was the same, cautious voices urging patience, hesitations about provoking Germany further. Churchill's temper often flared. He slammed his fist against the table more than once. "Do you think Hitler will show us patience?" he roared one afternoon. "Every day we wait, Poland bleeds, and our people grow restless. Action, not hesitation, will keep this island alive." His colleagues shifted uncomfortably, but his words cut deep. At home, Clementine saw the strain growing. He slept little, pacing the halls of Downing Street long after midnight, dictating notes to secretaries at odd hours, his voice echoing through the quiet house. She tried to coax him into rest, but he would only grumble, "There is no rest now, Clemmy. The tide of war does not stop for sleep." And yet, in rare quiet moments, he softened. One evening, he sat with his daughter Mary by the fire. She was only 16, her eyes wide with questions she did not voice. He put an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. For a few minutes, he spoke not of fleets and convoys, but of gardens, horses, painting, fragments of normal life. She leaned against him, comforted by his warmth, though she could sense the storm that pressed behind his silence. The waiting was hardest for the ordinary people. In pubs and factories, men muttered that the government had done little beyond words. Women rationed food carefully, fearing shortages that had not yet arrived. Children played in the streets, gas masks slung across their backs like toys, unaware of how soon they might need them. The nation lived in a twilight of anticipation. Churchill, more than anyone, understood that waiting could sap courage. He demanded action, pressed constantly for offensive measures at sea, urged raids, reconnaissance, pressure. He knew that a war of hesitation was already a war half lost. And so, though the skies above London remained silent, Churchill carried in his heart the certainty that the silence was temporary. The blow would come, from the air, from the sea, from the iron will of Germany unleashed against Britain. Late one night, standing at his window with the blackout curtain drawn just slightly, he whispered to the city asleep below, "They think us idle, but we are not. We are sharpening our sword, and when they strike, we shall strike back harder still." By October 1939, the war had settled into a grim routine. Each morning brought new reports of ships sunk, sailors lost, convoys harried across the Atlantic. Churchill began to feel the war as an endless echo of telegrams and signals, each one a tally of danger, each one another test of his resolve. The Admiralty war room became his second home. Its walls were lined with maps of every sea and ocean, pins marking the fragile arteries of supply that kept Britain alive. The great table in the center was strewn with charts and ciphered dispatches. Staff officers bent over them constantly, their faces pale in the lamplight. The air smelled of tobacco, ink, and fatigue. Churchill thrived amid the intensity. He prowled the room with restless energy, dictating orders, barking questions, demanding detail. Where are the destroyers on the western approach? What of convoy HX-12? Has the Ark Royal sailed? His voice carried the urgency of a man who felt the seas in his very blood. But for all his ferocity, there was also weariness. More than once, his secretaries saw him pause at the edge of the table, shoulders slumped, eyes shadowed. He would grip the wood with both hands, gathering himself, then straighten and thunder on as if nothing had happened. The burden was not only professional, but deeply personal. Churchill loved the Royal Navy. He had called it "my first mistress," and every sinking struck him like a wound. When he read of the Royal Oak torpedoed at Scapa Flow, more than 800 sailors lost in a single night, He sat in silence for a long while, his cigar forgotten, ash falling unnoticed onto his coat. Finally, he murmured, "Poor fellows, trapped in their steel tomb." Then, more sharply, his jaw tightening, "But we must not despair. The fleet will avenge them." At times, the strain broke through his mask. One afternoon, after hours of grim reports, he left the Admiralty and walked alone down Whitehall, his hat pulled low, his cane tapping against the pavement. The air was damp, the sky overcast, and the streets nearly deserted under blackout regulations. He walked without destination, his thoughts heavy, until he reached the embankment. There, he paused, gazing out over the Thames. The river flowed dark and slow, indifferent as always. He leaned on the railing, cigar smoke drifting across the water, and whispered, "So many lives already given, and this is only the beginning." But he did not allow despair to consume him. Returning to his office, he summoned his staff with renewed vigor. He spoke of strategy, of innovation, of breaking the stranglehold of the U-boats. He urged the development of new tactics, pressed for more escort vessels, and insisted on cooperation with the French Navy. His energy was relentless, infectious. Those around him found themselves swept up in his conviction, even when exhaustion dragged at their bones. In the evenings, he carried the burden home. Clementine saw it in his eyes, in the way he collapsed into his armchair, whiskey in hand, staring into the fire without speaking for long minutes. Sometimes she would draw him out gently, coaxing him to speak of art, of books, of his beloved bricklaying at Chartwell. Other times, she simply sat with him, her quiet presence a balm against the storm. One night, after a particularly heavy day of losses at sea, she said softly, "You cannot save them all, Winston." He turned to her sharply, his face lined with pain. "But I must try. Every ship, every man, is a piece of Britain herself. If we let them slip away, what will be left of us?" She reached for his hand, and for a moment, the great lion of Britain allowed himself to lean into her strength. The burden of the Admiralty was immense, a constant weight pressing on his shoulders, threatening to crush even him. But Churchill bore it as he had always borne burdens, with fire, with stubbornness, with the unshakable conviction that he, and he alone, was destined to stand against the tide. And though the seas grew darker with every passing week, he carried within him a flame that refused to be extinguished. By November 1939, the phony war dragged on. Britain was officially at war, but the great battles had not yet reached her shores. To the public, it sometimes felt like a war of waiting. Sirens tested, blackouts enforced, shelters dug, but the skies still empty of German bombers. For Churchill, there was no illusion. The war was not distant. It was already being waged beneath the sea, and in the corridors of government, and in the minds of the people. And it was his task to keep that truth alive. Each day at the Admiralty began with dispatches. Convoys sighted, convoys lost, submarines sunk, submarines escaped, numbers and names, ships and tonnage. The war reduced to figures on paper, but behind every number were lives. When a destroyer failed to report, Churchill imagined the faces of the sailors, their mothers, their sweethearts, their families waiting by radios. He bore them all, silently, as if carved into his chest. One morning, after a long session in the war room, Churchill strode into his private office, slamming the door behind him. He dropped heavily into his chair, his cigar clenched tightly between his teeth. His secretary followed timidly, placing another report on his desk. He read it quickly, then muttered, "More names for the sea. The sea is greedy, always greedy." His voice was low, almost like a growl. But the very next moment, he straightened, his eyes flashing with renewed fire. "We must not yield to despair," he declared, dictating a message for the fleet. "The seas are cruel, But our duty is greater than the cruelty. Stand firm, strike boldly. Remember, you guard the life of Britain herself." Beyond the Admiralty, the political situation pressed upon him too. Chamberlain remained Prime Minister, cautious and restrained, his style ill-suited to the storm that Churchill believed was coming. In the cabinet, Churchill's voice was often the loudest, warning, urging, demanding action. Some resented him, some feared him, but all recognized that his words carried a power others lacked. He was not merely preparing fleets, he was preparing himself for a greater role. At home, Clementine saw it most clearly. One evening, as they sat together in the drawing room, she studied him quietly. His face was weary, yet alive with energy, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted his whiskey glass. "You are not only fighting Hitler, Winston," she said softly. "You are fighting the years that lie ahead. Do not burn yourself out before they even arrive." He looked at her, his eyes shadowed but determined. "If I burn out, Clemmy, it will be in flame. Better flame than ash." She said nothing more, but the words lingered between them, heavy with meaning. The people of Britain, too, were waiting for flame. They listened to Chamberlain's cautious addresses on the wireless, but in pubs and factories and kitchens, whispers grew louder. It was Churchill they trusted to speak for them. His voice, when broadcast in short statements for the Admiralty, stirred something that Chamberlain's never could. It carried not just information, but defiance, a reminder that Britain would not bow. Late in November, Churchill stood once more at his window, the blackout curtain drawn back an inch. The streets below were silent, the city cloaked in shadow. He gazed at the darkness, seeing not just the present, but the future. The bombs that would fall, the fires that would rage, the ships that would sink, the men who would die. The weight of it pressed upon him like a mountain. And yet, within that weight, he felt also a strange certainty. He had lived his whole life for great moments, and now he sensed that history was drawing him to its center. He whispered into the silence, "The test is coming, and when it comes, I must be ready." Then, drawing the curtain shut, he turned back to his desk, lit another cigar, and bent once more over the endless papers of war. The weight of the future was heavy, but he bore it willingly, as if destiny itself had chosen him for the task. By December 1939, the uneasy stillness began to fracture. Though the skies above London remained quiet, the seas grew more dangerous by the day. German U-boats struck with deadly precision, sending merchant ships to the bottom, their crews scattered across icy waters. Each telegram that reached the Admiralty brought with it new grief. Churchill, pacing the war room, felt the tension mounting. He stabbed at charts with his cigar, his gravelly voice filling the chamber. "We must choke them before they choke us. Send more escorts. Patrol wider. Strike harder." His energy drove his staff forward, though they often staggered beneath the weight of his demands. Then came a glimmer of good news. In late December, a British squadron clashed with the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee off the coast of South America. The battle was fierce, but the enemy ship, damaged and cornered, scuttled herself in Montevideo harbor. When the news reached Britain, cheers rang out. For the first time since September, the people tasted something like victory. Churchill seized on it instantly. He drafted a message to the fleet, his words ringing with defiance. "This is not the end, nor even the beginning of the end, but it is proof that the Navy will not falter." His secretaries scribbled quickly, their pens barely keeping pace. For a brief moment, morale lifted. In pubs across Britain, pints were raised. In factories, workers smiled through their fatigue. In London streets, people whispered that perhaps the old lion's fire was already working wonders. Yet Churchill knew better. One battle did not change the tide. The U-boats still prowled, the Atlantic still swallowed lives, and Hitler's armies still held Europe in their grip. Victory at sea was not yet secure. It was only proof that courage could still shine in darkness. In cabinet meetings, he pressed harder. He spoke not only of ships and convoys, but of the larger war to come. "The enemy will not stop with Poland," he warned, his voice booming across the chamber. "They will strike at France, at the Low Countries, at us. We must steel ourselves now, or we shall be broken later." Some ministers shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to peer so far ahead. But Churchill refused to soften his warnings. At home, the strain deepened. He slept little, ate irregularly, drank more than was wise. Clementine watched him with worry, yet also with pride. She knew the fire within him could not be extinguished, only tempered. One evening, she told him quietly, "Winston, you are carrying them all. The sailors, the soldiers, the people. Do not forget that you carry yourself as well." He looked at her, weary-eyed but smiling faintly. "My dear Clemmy, I will rest when the war is won." December nights brought another layer of unease. Air raid sirens wailed more often, though the bombers did not yet come. Londoners rushed to shelters, huddled in underground stations, waited in tense silence until the all-clear sounded. Churchill heard the sirens from his study, their mournful rise and fall cutting through his work. He would pause, listening, his face grim. "They are testing us," he muttered once. "Soon enough, they will strike, in earnest." Christmas came and went, subdued. In Downing Street, a small tree stood in the corner, its lights dimmed for blackout. Clementine tried to bring warmth to the day. A simple meal, carols sung softly, their children gathered close. Churchill raised his glass, his voice unsteady but resolute. "We celebrate tonight not in abundance, but in defiance. The enemy cannot darken our spirit." Afterward, when the house grew quiet, he returned to his study. He stood once more at the window, the curtain drawn back just an inch, gazing out at the shadowed city. In the distance, the Thames gleamed faintly under moonlight, eternal and steady. He lit another cigar, the glow reflected faintly in the glass, and whispered, "This silence will not last. The fire is coming, and when it does, we must be ready to endure it." The cracks in the silence were spreading. Churchill felt them in his bones. The waiting would not go on forever. As the new year of 1940 arrived, the war that had begun with silence now loomed with inevitability. The world seemed poised on the edge of catastrophe, yet Britain still waited, its people listening for the thunder that had not yet come. Churchill, however, no longer thought of the silence as emptiness. He saw it as preparation, a gathering of will, a sharpening of resolve. The Royal Navy patrolled the oceans with vigilance. Factories turned out munitions by day and by night, and families adjusted to the rhythm of blackouts and ration books. A nation was learning how to endure. At the Admiralty, Churchill continued his relentless pace. Each day brought him closer to exhaustion, yet he refused to yield. His staff marveled at his stamina, even as they whispered about the toll it was taking. "He is like a furnace," one aide remarked, "always burning, always demanding more fuel." One evening, after a long session in the war room, Churchill lingered by the great maps. His cigar burned low as he studied the pins and strings stretched across Europe. He saw Poland already lost, France bracing for attack, Britain standing alone yet unbroken. He pressed his hand flat against the map and whispered, "This island will endure. However dark the night, the dawn will come." That night, back at Downing Street, Clementine found him in his study, the fire casting a warm glow across his tired face. She sat beside him, her knitting in her lap, and for a time they were silent together. Then she said softly, "When the storm breaks, Winston, the people will need not only your strength, but your hope." He turned to her, his eyes heavy yet shining. "Then I shall give them both, with every word, With every breath, I shall give them both. As winter deepened, London remained tense. Sirens wailed more frequently, though the skies stayed empty. Children carried their gas masks as if they were toys. Men in pubs argued in hushed tones about when the real war would begin. Everywhere, the question hung unspoken. How long can this waiting last? And then, one cold morning, Churchill rose early and stepped outside alone. The mist clung to Whitehall as it had on that first morning in September, when he had walked through silence before the declaration of war. His breath fogged in the chill air, his boots echoed against the pavement, and for a moment he was simply a man walking beneath the dim lamps of London. But he was no longer the same man. The weight of the first months of war had settled into his bones, tempered his resolve, and stripped away any lingering illusions. He no longer wondered if he was ready for history's call. He knew that he was. He paused at the gates of St. James's Park, gazing into the shadowed trees, listening to the faint hum of a city still asleep. In that quiet moment, he felt the ghosts of the past at his side. The soldiers of Flanders, the sailors of Scapa Flow, the mothers and fathers of Britain waiting in their homes. He drew his coat tighter around him and whispered into the mist, "We shall not falter. Whatever lies ahead, we shall not falter." Turning back toward Downing Street, his pace quickened. The waiting was nearly over. The storm was gathering, and when it broke, Britain would look to him. Winston Churchill walked on, his silhouette swallowed by fog, his cigar glowing faintly like a beacon in the dark. A man carrying the weight of a nation, preparing to speak for its soul. And with every step, the private walk of one man became the march of an entire people, toward sacrifice, toward struggle, and toward survival. The story of Churchill's walk before announcing war is not merely about footsteps in the mist. It is about the transformation of silence into resolve, of fear into defiance, of a solitary man into the voice of a nation. His walk ended at the doors of power, but the journey it began would carry Britain and the world through its darkest hour.